Hey, welcome back for another Trick Tip Tuesday, and today I'm going to be talking about sanding your welds down on the sheet metal when you're TIGging panels together. So I guess this would apply to MIG weld as well, but these belt guards here that we put together starts out as two pieces. So you have a top panel and then one side panel. It becomes a strip around the side, and those get welded together around here. We TIG weld them. That way we can hammer the seams flat, make sure they're nice and true. That way when everything's all metal finished out, you get a nice smooth looking belt guard here. So basically I'm just going to be describing the process that I use for sanding the welds down in a way where you're not harming the sheet metal around it, and you can blend it all together and make it look really nice. So basically, you know, there's going to be different schools of thought on this. So some people are going to have totally different ideas on it, and that's fine. Basically, this is from my experience, what I've used in the past, what I found has worked the best for me, and you know, to be able to get the work done as efficiently as possible, you know, to speed up the job, that sort of thing. So some guys want to use you know, files, or just try to hammer the weld out and all that kind of stuff. And you know, I suppose there's the right circumstances for that in some ways, but I've always found that getting the weld down with a sanding disc first is the most efficient way to get the job done. So, but these tips are going to be based on getting the weld down without harming the metal around it. So basically, I do a multi-step process where I start out with a 36 grit disc. So it's going to be obviously a fairly heavy grit. So with that, you need to be very careful about how you're sanding, the direction you're sanding, all that kind of stuff, because with the 36 grit, you'll dig into the sheet metal real fast and need to make sure you don't catch a wrong edge, that sort of thing, and damage your part and cause yourself more work. So the whole theory that I use when sanding is to try to, as much as possible, especially on the starting process, is to mainly just try to hit the weld. And then obviously once you get it really close to being smooth down to the surface of the sheet metal, at that point then I would switch to a finer grit disc and, you know, continue the process and going over it until I get it to where I can kind of blend the area together. And if I need to do, once I get it down, if I have a couple of highs and lows, maybe at that point I can use a hammer to then smooth the surface out before I do the very final sanding on it. So 36 grit disc, I like to use ceramic discs because they hold up longer, they hold up better to heat. That's the number one killer of an abrasive, is heat. So if you start with a material that is resistant to that heat, it's going to last longer for you and get the job done in a way that maybe you might have to be changing out more discs and that sort of thing. So I use ceramic grit discs as far as the actual sanding disc goes, as far as the grit. So essentially, to start, something I never do, and especially on a radius like this piece, you know, it has about a 1-inch radius, you know, around the edge of this whole thing. So one thing I would never do is, if you picture the sander over the weld like this, when it's rotating this way and it's spinning, is to never go across the weld in this direction on a corner. And the reason for that is the contact area on the radius is already very small. So if you have a flat surface going across a curve, it doesn't take a whole lot to dig down into that high point. So what I always try to make sure I do, instead of holding the sander like this so that maybe the weld is kind of going through the middle of the sanding pad, but to where the disc is actually going across at a 90 degree to the weld, I actually hold it so that the disc is actually, when it's spinning, it's bringing the grit across the weld in a similar direction as the direction of the weld. And what that's going to do is it's going to give the disc more surface area. So if you picture the weld, if my finger was the weld, if you picture the disc going across the weld this direction, it gives the sanding discs more contact area and will allow you to sand the weld down more without hitting it in such a small spot. It's gonna, like I said, it's gonna extend that contact area of the sanding disc across the weld in this direction. So like I said, instead of holding the sander like this and going across the weld this way with the grit of the disc, I'm holding it this way and going across the weld this direction as the disc is spinning. So that's essentially the theory of how I sand a weld down, and that I pretty much use regardless if I'm welding something flat or if I'm sanding on something flat or something with a radius, that sort of thing. So like I said, it changes the contact area of the sanding disc. So for starters, I'll go ahead and sand a little bit of this weld down. Like I said, I keep it this way and I kind of will work it back and forth like this, and what that will allow me to do is to kind of rotate the sander a little bit this way and back and forth to be staying right on the surface that I'm trying to hit and trying to blend it in. So we'll go ahead and start sanding a little bit of this weld down and go from there. Now you can see just with that little bit, you can see that the sanding scratches are pretty much right on the surface of the weld. I mean, it's going to be impossible to not hit the surface of the sheet metal, but that's why you take this approach where you're majority hitting the weld and barely touching the surface of the sheet metal itself. So when you start sanding like this, and then you swap to a finer grit disc and then a finer grit disc, and you work it down in the steps, then it's going to allow you to blend that area in together to where nothing is damaging the surface of your sheet metal. So I'll go ahead and finish up this a little bit in this section. I'll switch to the next disc and we'll keep blending it in. So I'll switch to from a 36 to a 60 grit disc. And just to clarify too, the whole reason for on a part like this for stepping down in grit and going finer and finer every time is because the further you grind that weld down, the more the disc is going to be hitting the actual remaining sheet metal that you need. So the finer the grit, the less damage and the less scratches it leaves, and as far as the depth of the scratch, and it's easier to blend out at that point and make it a nice fine smooth piece. So did a little bit of work there with that 60. Starts to really blend it in, and usually at this point, this is when I'll take a hammer just to verify that I'm still flat where I need to be, because now that I got pretty much the majority of the weld off of there, I'll take the hammer and just run over the surface. And again, that's just to make sure that the surface is nice and smooth. And then I'll go to a 120 grit for the final actual sanding grit disc. So you can see after that little bit of welding that the sanding scratches are pretty much right where the weld was. You can still see a little bit of the heat trail from the weld on both sides, but the weld is nice and smooth. It's gone. So at this point, I mean, you really could leave it if you wanted to. You know, it depends on how the exact finish you want on your part. But at this point, usually what I do is I'll go to even a Scotch-Brite disc. So this is just a red Scotch-Brite disc, kind of a medium coarseness. So I'll do that, kind of blend out the area a little more, and then I'll even, like I said, depending on what you're working on and the finish you're looking for on your part, you can take it even further. This is a soft, fine blue Scotch-Brite type pad, and then from there you could DA sand it, that sort of thing. All depends on the full final finish you're looking for. So these Scotch-Brite pads are, I mean, they're basically just rubbing the surface. They're not digging in and removing a lot of material, just really blending it all in. So you can see right there, that would be our final product. So obviously I'll need to go around and finish the rest of this, but hopefully this gives you some things to think about, some things to try when it comes to sanding a weld down. Like I said, this would work whether you're doing TIG or MIG. This is all TIG weld, but the main goal when you're doing this on a sheet metal part is to not damage the metal that you need still in your part. It's just to get the weld sanded off, make sure it's nice and smooth, and you have a nice finish on the outside. And hopefully this gives you some pointers to try in your own shop. So thanks for watching this week's Trick Tip Tuesday. Email us tips@Trick-Tools.com. Send us your ideas. We'll see what we can do to include them in these videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.